Alright, today we're going to be starting work on our Unit 5 proportions unit. Today we're specifically going to be talking about making proportions and using WKU. So in our notes, this is going to be in page 6, so make sure that you are turned to the right page. And we're going to get started. So looking at proportions, just a quick review. WKU can help us to write our proportions correctly. There are a lot of different ways that we can write proportions and still be correct, and this is where we get to the very, very important piece. So when we are writing proportions, it is incredibly important, so important, to line up the pieces that correspond or go together. So to help us remember that, we have our WKU. This is our graphic organizer. And this is what I'm going to be looking for each time that you are solving a proportion word problem. So there are 3 parts to WKU, obviously 3 letters. The W stands for words. The K stands for what you know. And the U stands for the unknown, what you don't know yet. And we're going to be using WKU to help us to solve these types of problems. So let's look at one example. In example 1, we know that 2 gallons of gas cost $5.30, and we want to know how much 5 gallons of gas are going to cost. So we can use WKU. So I'm going to show you one way first, then we're going to look at another way that we can write it. So this first way, I've started writing it out here. I've got the money on top of my ratio, my fraction, and then I've got gallons on the bottom. So now I've got to fill in that information. I've got to go back into my word problem to figure that out. So as I'm looking here, I know, and that's a key word. This is something that I'm going to use for K. So we know that 2 gallons of gas costs $5.30. I have 2 pieces of information there. I can put it into my ratio. According to my words, I know that money needs to go on top. So my money here was $5.30. So I know that $5.30 will buy me 2 gallons. Remember, the gallons need to go on the bottom. So I've used what I've set up. I figured out I was using gallons and I'm using money. I picked that money is going to go on top, gallons is going to go on the bottom, and so I've set up my proportion. Now I'm trying to figure out what I don't know. What I don't know, let's see, I'll use blue for this. Orange. I want to know, so this is stuff that I don't know, unknown, how much 5 gallons of gas is going to cost. So I know I'm going to use that 5 right there. That 5 goes with 5 gallons. So even though it's on 2 lines, I got to remember that that's where I'm going to put it. So in my unknown here, that U column, I'm going to use that 5 gallons. So I know that 5 goes with that gallons, gallons goes on the bottom. So the 5 is going to go underneath here, and I'm looking for the cost. Well, I don't know what the cost is, so I'm going to use a variable to hold its spot. I'm going to use the letter X. Now, WKU helps me to write it out, but it does not help me to solve it. So to solve it, I have to go back to that cross multiplying, and remember, that's where you take the top of the first fraction times the bottom of the second. So that's $5.30 times 5, which is going to give me $26.50. And then I've also got to do the other side. 2 times x, well, the only thing I can do is put them together, and I'm going to write that as 2x. So now I'm going to go ahead and start my railroad. And this goes back to our equation unit. You've got to show every single step. So go ahead and draw your railroads in there. Now in order to get x alone, I have to get rid of that 2. So I'm going to do the opposite. They're squished together. Squished together means multiply. The opposite is dividing. So I'm going to divide both sides by 2, and I'm going to get that x equals $13.25. And that's actually the price of 5 gallons. So I'm going to write that again nice and big so I can see it. $13.25. So now let's try it a different way. In my second row here, I've got the 2 on top and the $5.30 on the bottom. Well, before, you can see that that's opposite of what I wrote the first time. This time, I'm putting money on the bottom of my fraction and gallons on the top. And we're going to see what happens when I solve it this way. Well, I'm still going to use that 5 gallons. I still want to know how much 5 gallons is going to cost. So I'm going to put a 5. Remember, I've got to line this up. So I've got gallons on the top, 2 on the top, 5 is going to go on the top. Got to keep it the same the entire way. And then my money to put on the bottom, I was looking for $5.30 is what I know, but I still don't know how much it's going to cost. So I'm trying to rewrite this problem, do it again. So you can see that both of my fractions here, my fractions on the top, are almost completely flipped to the fractions on the bottom. So I'm solving it 2 different ways and seeing how it's going to work out. I'm still going to cross multiply though. So I've got a 2 and an x makes 2x. And that 5 and the $5.30 is going to make $26.50 again. And you can see that this is the exact same railroad. When I solve this and divide both sides by 2, I'm going to once again get x equals $13.25. So my price of 5 gallons, even though I wrote it another way, gives me my exact same answer. And that's what I'm trying to make you see here. It says, what did you notice about our 2 answers above? They are the same, even though the proportions were set up differently. Ran out of room there, but make sure that you've got differently there. That's incredibly important. So again, 3 stars. This is a key idea here. When solving proportions, it does not matter how you write those ratios as long as you line up the information the same way for the whole problem. So in my first row, I decided money's going to be on top, so I kept money on top for both of my fractions there. In the second one, I put money on the bottom, but I had to keep the $5.30 and the x on the bottom of my fractions. So I pick one and I go with it, and we have to use WKU to make sure that we are keeping it even. All right, let's go ahead and try another example. This one's a little bit different because it does have a map. So taking a look just at my pictures, I see I've got a couple of streets. I've got a star, which stands for, I'm looking at my key, it looks like Caitlin's house, and a moon, which stands for Anna's house. And a really important thing whenever we're looking at a map is to look for that scale. Remember, scale is a real-world example of where we can use proportions. So yes, there's a lot going on in that map, but the scale is the most important piece here. So it says on the map, Caitlin's house is 3 centimeters from Anna's house. Well, I see a number there. I'm going to go ahead and make sure that I pay attention to that, and that is on the map. And then it says to use the scale and figure out how far Caitlin will have to walk to get to Anna's house. So I've got to set up my WKU, and to help me remember where to put everything, I like to make those same 3 columns that we just saw in the last example. Now, they don't always give that to you. In fact, usually they don't. But when you make those different columns, it's going to help you make sure that you don't miss any of those steps, that you fill in everything that you need to have. So remember, we're going to have 3 different proportions here. I'm going to write them as fractions. And I'm looking for the words. So to describe what different kinds of information we're using. Are we talking about dogs? Are we talking about cats? Are we talking about miles? Are we talking about cups or gallons? Well, my words that I see, especially in my scale, I see that I'm working with centimeters and feet. So I'm just going to go ahead and pick one. Remember, just pick which way it's going to go, write it in your words, and stick with it the whole time. Well, they wrote centimeters first in the scale. I'm going to go ahead and put that one on the top. So again, words here, I put centimeters on the top, and then the other word that we're going to be dealing with is feet. Those are the labels that we're talking about for this problem. So I've got centimeters to feet that I'm talking about. Those are the proportions that I'm making. Now I've got to figure out what I know. Well, the really nice thing here is that my scale has everything filled in. I know that my scale is correct. So I'm going to go ahead and use those numbers in the scale there. Well, I know that 1 centimeter is equal to 60 feet. I talked about the centimeters and the feet. I know where I'm going to write them because of my words. So I've got 1 centimeter. And remember, centimeters I put on the top of my fraction. So when I look at my no column, I'm going to put the 1 on the top. I also know how many feet goes with 1 centimeter. If you look at my scale, I've got that 60 feet. And feet needs to go on the bottom of my fraction, so I'm going to put my 60 underneath there. And now I'm trying to figure out, what are they asking me? So it says, how far will she have to walk, Caitlin have to walk to get to Anna's house? Well, there's another piece of information here. I also have that it was 3 centimeters on the map. So I don't actually have to go and measure this on the map to figure out what I'm using for centimeters. They told me really nice and clearly here that I'm dealing with 3 centimeters. I want to know how many feet 3 centimeters is going to go with. Well, remember, centimeters is on the top of my fraction. I picked that at the beginning. It's got to stay on the top the entire way. So I'm going to put a 3 up there. But I don't know how many feet that actually is, so I have to use my variable to hold its spot. I'm going to go ahead and write an x. So now I've set up my WKU, and I put a lot of information into this. I know what each one of these numbers stands for. I know what I'm trying to figure out. I'm trying to figure out how many feet 3 centimeters is going to stand for on this map. So now I'm ready to go ahead and cross multiply and solve. So I like to go ahead and draw a line. You can either put a loop around it, or you can draw a line between the two things that you're multiplying. So I am multiplying 1 times x. And the only thing I can do there is put them together. So I've got 1x. And then I'm going to also multiply the other side, 3 times 60. Well, 3 times 6 is 18. Add that 0 on there. So I've got 1x equals 180. Well, that's a really easy one to solve because remember, I don't always have to write that 1 at the beginning. I can just write x, and that's going to be just 180. But don't forget your label. I've got 180 feet. So I've just found out that Caitlin will actually have to walk 180 feet to get to Anna's house. So I can use my WKU to help me set up my problem, but I've still got to know how to cross multiply and how to solve that equation to figure out the actual answer to the problem. WKU is not the answer, it's just a tool to help us get there. So we're going to have a lot of time to practice setting up these proportions in class, but remember, whatever you pick to line it up, you just have to stick with it the entire time. If I chose to put feet on the top and centimeters on the bottom, I would still get the right answer. I just have to make sure that in my known ratio and in my unknown ratio that I have it lined up correctly.